When we begin to look beneath our cities, one detail stands out immediately. The architecture does not behave the way we expect it to. The lower levels of many historic buildings do not resemble basements. They are not rough, unfinished, or purely functional spaces. Instead, they mirror the architectural language of the floors above them. Stonework follows the same proportions. Window spacing remains consistent. Columns, arches, and decorative elements align perfectly from top to bottom. This is not accidental. In traditional construction, basements are designed to support weight, not to be seen. They are usually built with simpler materials, thicker walls, and minimal ornamentation. Any decorative effort is reserved for the visible portions of the building. Yet, in city after city, the buried levels display the same care, symmetry, and refinement as the upper floors. In some cases, the masonry beneath the street is even more detailed than what remains visible today. This creates a fundamental architectural contradiction. If these spaces were always meant to be underground, why were they built with such precision and aesthetic intent? Why invest time, resources, and skilled labor into areas that were supposedly never meant to be seen? The alignment is especially difficult to explain. Columns do not abruptly change size at street level. Walls do not suddenly thicken. Windows do not shift position. Instead, the structure appears continuous, as if the building was originally designed as a complete whole from ground to roof, not as a structure with a hidden secondary layer beneath it. This suggests that the buried sections were not afterthoughts. They were part of the original design. In some cities, excavation reveals that these lower floors even contain finished flooring, interior partitions, and evidence of regular human use. These are not spaces created simply to hold up the building above them. They appear to have been functional environments. When viewed in isolation, a single example might be dismissed as an anomaly, but these architectural patterns repeat with remarkable consistency. They appear in civic buildings, residential blocks, train stations, and industrial complexes. They appear in wealthy districts and working-class neighborhoods alike, and they appear in cities that followed entirely different historical trajectories. This repetition challenges the idea that these buried floors were the result of random urban development decisions. Architecture follows rules. Those rules are shaped by purpose, and the purpose of these buried levels remains unexplained. Another troubling detail emerges when examining construction techniques. The materials used in these lower levels often match the materials of the upper floors exactly. Same stone, same brick, same mortar composition. In some cases, later renovations above ground use different materials, while the buried sections preserve the original construction. This implies that the buried floors are older than what sits above them today. If cities gradually raised street levels over time, we would expect to see clear transitions, different materials, different construction methods, clear evidence of adaptation. Instead, what we see suggests continuity, not modification. The architecture does not tell a story of gradual burial. It tells a story of sudden redefinition. In certain buildings, doorways are found beneath the street that align perfectly with doorways above, as if they once served the same function. Staircases descend into spaces that were clearly designed for movement, not storage. Hallways continue into darkness, abruptly sealed where modern ground levels begin. This raises another question. Why would builders design circulation spaces, doors, stairs, corridors, in areas that were never meant to be accessible? The more closely these structures are examined, the harder it becomes to accept that they were always intended to be hidden. And yet, official historical narratives rarely address these inconsistencies. Architectural surveys often acknowledge the existence of buried floors, but offer no explanation beyond vague references to urban development. There is little attempt to reconcile the sophistication of these spaces, with their supposed purpose. This silence is telling, because architecture, unlike written history, does not lie. It preserves intention in stone, and the intention embedded in these buried structures does not match the story we have been told. If the architecture beneath our cities does not behave like architecture meant to be underground, then we must consider another possibility, that these spaces were once above ground, that they belonged to an earlier phase of the city, one that was later obscured, altered, or built over. This does not require speculation about who built them or why they were buried. It only requires us to acknowledge what the structures themselves are telling us. They were designed to be seen. They were designed to be used. And at some point, they were deliberately hidden. The question is not whether this happened. The question is why. Once the architecture itself raises questions, another detail becomes impossible to ignore. Across cities worldwide, windows and doors appear below modern street level. Not a few isolated cases, entire rows of them. In many historic districts, lower floors sit partially or completely underground, yet their windows remain carefully framed, evenly spaced, and proportionally identical to the floors above. These are not ventilation slits. They are full-sized windows, designed to let in light. Light only makes sense if there was once open air outside. Basement windows are typically small, placed high on the wall, and built with purely functional intent. Their purpose is ventilation, not visibility. But the windows found beneath many cities do not follow this logic. They are large, they are aligned, and they are placed at heights consistent with human eye level. This suggests they were never meant to face soil. In some cases, iron grills remain intact, implying security concerns rather than structural necessity. In others, decorative stone frames surround the glass, identical to those found on the upper floors. These details point to a time when these windows were part of a street-facing facade. Doors tell an even more compelling story. Throughout Europe and North America, sealed doorways are discovered beneath sidewalks. Some are bricked up, others are simply blocked by layers of earth. Their proportions match normal entrances. Their thresholds show wear patterns consistent with repeated use. Doors exist for movement. They imply access, circulation, and daily activity. Yet, modern streets pass directly over them. In some cities, staircases descend from the current ground level toward these sealed entrances, suggesting that at some point people moved freely between these levels. The stairs were not emergency exits or maintenance shafts. They were designed for regular foot traffic. This raises a difficult question. Why would a city design functional entrances only to bury them later? Official explanations often suggest that street levels were raised gradually over time, but gradual change does not easily account for the consistency we observe. If streets rose slowly, we would expect windows to be partially altered, doors relocated, and access points adapted. Instead, many buried entrances remain intact, as if they were simply abandoned rather than modified. The transition appears abrupt. In some excavations, entire doorframes are found preserved beneath layers of fill, with no signs of partial reconstruction. Walls do not taper. Openings are not resized. They are simply cut off from the surface. This suggests that these doors were not slowly absorbed by urban development. They were intentionally sealed. Another troubling detail is the distribution of these features. Buried windows and doors appear not only in residential buildings, but also in public structures, government buildings, train stations, warehouses, schools, places that once required visibility, accessibility, and movement. It is difficult to argue that such spaces were designed to be underground from the start. In several cities, archival photographs reveal buildings during construction already showing buried lower levels. In others, excavation exposes older sidewalks beneath the current ones, complete with curbs and drainage systems. Sidewalks imply pedestrians, pedestrians imply streets, and streets imply an active cityscape if these lower levels were once part of everyday urban life. Their disappearance represents more than simple renovation. It suggests a reorganization of the city itself. This pattern repeats across continents, from Paris to Chicago, from Rome to Montreal, from smaller regional towns to major capitals, different cultures, different climates, different historical contexts, yet the same architectural features appear below ground. Such consistency is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. It points to a shared process, or at least a shared outcome, affecting cities on a broad scale. Windows and doors are not abstract architectural elements. They are interfaces between inside and outside. They define how people interact with space. When these interfaces are buried, it suggests a fundamental change in how the city relates to itself. At some point, what was once street level became something else, and the city above moved on, leaving the lower world sealed and forgotten. This does not tell us who made that decision or why it was made, but it does tell us that the buried levels were once alive with activity. They were built to be seen, they were built to be entered, and they were built to serve people. Whatever caused their disappearance, it was not random, it was systematic. And that realization brings us to an even larger question. If windows and doors beneath our cities once opened onto streets, what kind of streets were they? Once we accept that windows and doors beneath our cities were once functional, another question immediately follows. How much material would it take to bury them? The answer is unsettling. Raising an entire street by even one floor requires an enormous volume of earth, stone, and debris. This is not a minor construction effort. It is a massive logistical operation that would rival some of the largest urban projects in history. To bury a single city block by just 2 meters would require thousands of tons of fill. Multiply that by dozens of blocks, then by entire districts, and the scale quickly becomes staggering. Now imagine repeating this process across multiple cities. If such an effort had taken place gradually, we would expect to see clear evidence of adaptation. Buildings would show partial infill. Windows would be cut down. Doors would be relocated. Staircases would be shortened or removed. But that is not what we see. Instead, entire lower floors appear fully intact, simply sealed beneath new ground levels. Walls do not taper upward. Openings are not resized. The buried portions look frozen in time, as if the city above them was lifted and placed on top. This suggests something other than slow accumulation. It suggests a rapid and deliberate process. To move this much material quickly would require organized labor, centralized planning, and access to vast resources. Roads would need to be closed. Transportation networks would be overwhelmed. The operation would disrupt daily life on a massive scale. And yet, historical records describing such disruption are surprisingly scarce. Municipal archives rarely mention large-scale infill projects affecting entire districts. Where references do exist, they tend to be vague, fragmented, or limited to small areas. There are no detailed engineering reports describing how entire neighborhoods were raised, no comprehensive plans outlining the sourcing, transport, and disposal of fill material, no widespread photographic evidence capturing the process as it unfolded. This absence is difficult to reconcile with the scale of what we observe. The 19th century was an era of industrial efficiency. Railways, canals, and factories transformed landscapes at unprecedented speed. When such projects occurred, they were documented extensively. Bridges were photographed, tunnels were celebrated, urban expansions were recorded. So, Why does the burial of entire city layers leave so little trace? Some explanations suggest that cities reused debris from fires or demolitions as fill, but even this fails to account for the uniformity of what we see. Random debris produces irregular results, yet buried streets and floors appear level, consistent, and carefully aligned. Others propose that flooding forced cities to raise their streets, but flood mitigation typically focuses on drainage, levees, and river control, not the wholesale burial of finished architecture. And floods do not explain why decorative elements were left intact beneath the surface, rather than removed or adapted. Another possibility is that cities chose to build upward, constructing new streets over existing ones. But this still requires explanation. Building a new street on top of an old one does not automatically bury doors, windows, and staircases. It requires intentional sealing. Someone had to decide to cover these spaces. Someone had to execute that decision. The logistics become even more challenging when considering timing. In several cities, buried layers appear to have been sealed within a relatively narrow historical window. This implies coordination, or at least a shared response to some broader condition. Independent cities do not typically undertake identical large-scale projects at the same time without a compelling reason. And yet, the results look remarkably similar. The more closely the numbers are considered, the less plausible casual explanations become. Moving millions of tons of material is not something that happens quietly. It leaves marks on infrastructure, on labor markets, and on the daily lives of residents. If such operations occurred, they would have reshaped cities in ways that people remembered. But memory alone is not enough. Evidence matters, and the evidence we have does not match the scale implied by the buried architecture. This leads to an uncomfortable conclusion. Either these cities were not buried in the way we assume, or the events that caused this burial were far more significant than official narratives suggest. If the lower levels were not slowly covered by centuries of minor adjustments, then something else must have happened, something capable of altering entire urban landscapes rapidly and uniformly. Whatever that event was, it did not merely modify cities, it redefined them. And if the scale of the burial does not align with known urban development practices, then we are left with a gap, not just in our streets, but in our understanding of history. That gap demands attention, because the larger the buried space becomes, the harder it is to dismiss. By the time photography became widespread, cities were already documenting nearly everything: construction projects, street life, industrial growth, public events. The 19th century did not suffer from a lack of images, it produced them in abundance. This makes the absence of certain photographs especially troubling. In many cities, we can easily find images showing buildings before their lower levels were buried. We can also find photographs taken decades later showing those same buildings with entire floors missing beneath the street. What we almost never see are photographs of the transformation itself, the process, the moment when streets were raised, entrances sealed, and entire levels covered, is strangely invisible. This gap is difficult to explain. Large construction projects were popular photographic subjects. They symbolized progress, modernization, and civic pride. Photographers captured bridges as they rose, tunnels as they were carved, and railways as they expanded. If entire districts were undergoing dramatic elevation changes, photographers would have been present. But when it comes to the burial of city layers, the record falls silent. There are no widely known photo series showing streets being raised by meters, no detailed visual documentation of workers filling in doorways and windows across entire neighborhoods, no panoramic shots capturing the scale of the operation. Instead, history presents us with a before and after narrative, without the middle. This absence becomes even more striking when we consider how disruptive such work would have been. Streets would have been closed for extended periods, businesses relocated, transportation rerouted, daily life interrupted. Such disruption would have been noticed. It would have been discussed in newspapers. It would have been debated in city councils. It would have left behind extensive visual and written records. Yet, when researchers search archives, they often find only brief references, if any at all, mentions of improvements or street upgrades, without details proportional to the scale of what we see today. This raises the possibility that the burial of these city layers was not treated as a construction project in the usual sense. Perhaps it was not framed as progress, perhaps it was not celebrated, perhaps it was not meant to be examined closely. Another unsettling detail emerges when comparing different cities. The same photographic gap appears repeatedly. Paris, Chicago, Rome, Montreal, each city has abundant imagery documenting its growth. And yet, each also displays a similar absence when it comes to the transformation that buried parts of its earlier streets. Independent cities, different countries, different archives, and yet the same missing chapter. Coincidence becomes harder to accept. Photography does not simply disappear from history without a reason. It reflects what people considered important, visible, and worthy of record. So, why does such a large-scale transformation leave behind so little visual evidence? One explanation is that the change happened rapidly, too rapidly for systematic documentation. But even rapid events tend to leave traces, especially when they reshape entire urban environments. Another explanation is that the transformation was not fully understood at the time, that it unfolded as a response to circumstances that did not allow for careful planning or documentation. Or perhaps the simplest explanation is the most unsettling, that what happened was not something meant to be preserved in images. Photographs have a way of fixing reality. They freeze moments in time and make them difficult to reinterpret later. The absence of photographs leaves room for ambiguity. Without visual evidence, history becomes easier to simplify. This does not mean that photographs were deliberately destroyed. It does not require intent or conspiracy. Records can be lost, misfiled, or deprioritized over time. But the consistency of the absence suggests something structural rather than accidental. The story of buried cities is told through what remains visible: the architecture, the sealed doors, the hidden streets. It is not told through images of the transformation itself, and that silence speaks loudly, because when the visual record ends, precisely where the questions begin, it forces us to reconsider what we think we know. If photography captured nearly everything else, why does it fail us here? By this point, it becomes clear that what we are seeing is not confined to one city, one country, or one historical context. The same architectural anomalies appear across the world. In Paris, entire doorways sit sealed beneath modern sidewalks. Rows of windows disappear below street level, perfectly aligned with the floors above. Excavations reveal older walkways and drainage systems that no longer match the city we see today. In Chicago, construction projects regularly uncover sidewalks, storefronts, and building facades buried beneath layers of modern infrastructure. Engineers have documented multiple street levels stacked on top of one another, suggesting that the city has been rebuilt vertically more than once. Rome presents perhaps the most striking example. Layer upon layer of construction reveals streets, buildings, and public spaces belonging to different eras, all occupying the same physical space. Modern Rome does not sit beside ancient Rome. It sits directly on top of it. In Montreal, underground corridors and foundations extend beneath the city in ways that predate much of the visible urban fabric. These spaces were not improvised tunnels. They follow planned routes, aligned with buildings above them. These cities did not develop under the same governments. They did not share the same engineering traditions. They did not experience the same local disasters. And yet, the outcome looks remarkably similar. Lower floors buried, entrances sealed, older street levels forgotten. The consistency of these patterns across continents challenges the idea that they resulted from isolated local decisions. Urban planning rarely produces identical results in radically different environments unless driven by a shared condition or pressure. When patterns repeat globally, they usually point to a systemic cause. This does not mean a single event occurred everywhere at the same time. It means that different cities may have responded to similar circumstances in similar ways, producing the same architectural fingerprints. What is striking is not just the existence of buried layers, but their uniform characteristics. The same floor heights, the same alignment of windows, the same preservation of original materials beneath later construction. These similarities suggest that the buried layers belong to a common phase of urban development, one that predates the cities we recognize today. If these layers were simply remnants of gradual growth, we would expect variation, differences in depth, differences in construction quality, differences in how much was preserved or destroyed. Instead, what we see suggests a shared architectural logic. Cities across the world appear to have inherited structures from an earlier urban framework and then modified them in remarkably similar ways. And this raises a profound question. What kind of world produces cities that look alike beneath the surface, but different above it? Modern cities are shaped by local culture, politics, and geography, but buried cities seem to ignore those distinctions. They speak a more universal architectural language. This hints at the possibility that these lower layers were not created independently, but were part of a broader system of urban design, a system that once existed and was later altered. That does not require us to know who built it. It only requires us to recognize that its traces remain. Another detail strengthens this interpretation. In many cases, the buried layers appear more robust than what replaced them. Thicker walls, heavier stonework, construction techniques that favored durability over speed. This contrasts sharply with later urban expansion, which often prioritized efficiency and cost over longevity. If cities were simply modernizing, why replace stronger structures with weaker ones? The global pattern suggests not just change, but replacement. Something older was covered, something newer was built above it, and the transition appears to have happened quietly, without the level of attention we would expect for such a transformation. This does not mean history is hiding something intentionally. It means history may have simplified a process that was too complex, too disruptive, or too poorly understood to fully record. Cities are living organisms. They adapt, they rebuild, they forget. But when they forget in the same way across the world, it tells us that the forgetting itself may be part of the story. The buried layers beneath our cities are not isolated curiosities. They form a global pattern, and patterns demand explanation. At this point, the evidence beneath our cities begins to resemble something familiar, not urban development, as we are taught to understand it, but archaeology. In archaeology, civilizations are not discovered standing intact on the surface. They are uncovered in layers. Each layer represents a different phase of occupation, use, and transformation. Older layers lie below newer ones, preserved not because they were abandoned intentionally, but because something else replaced them. When we apply this perspective to modern cities, the buried streets and buildings start to make sense in a different way. What if our cities are not single, continuous constructions, but stacked environments? In many excavations, lower levels are found in surprisingly good condition. Walls remain upright, doorways are intact, streets retain their original alignment. In some cases, even drainage systems remain functional. This level of preservation is not typical of spaces that were slowly degraded over centuries. It is typical of spaces that were sealed. When archaeologists uncover ancient cities, they often find that preservation improves the deeper they go. Exposure causes decay. Burial preserves. If entire sections of our cities were buried relatively quickly, this would explain why so much remains intact beneath the surface. This framing also explains something else: why modern cities often seem disconnected from what lies below them. Street grids shift slightly, building orientations change, infrastructure layers do not perfectly align. These inconsistencies suggest that the city above was not simply an extension of the city below. It was a reorganization, a new layer. In some locations, excavation reveals multiple buried levels, each corresponding to a different period. Streets built on top of streets, buildings constructed over foundations that already belong to something else. This is not gradual urban evolution. It is stratification, and stratification implies episodes, moments when change happened quickly enough to leave distinct layers behind. What could cause such episodes? In archaeological contexts, layers are often formed by abrupt events, natural disasters, sudden abandonment, large-scale rebuilding following disruption. When similar layering appears beneath modern cities, it suggests that at least some phases of urban history were shaped by forces more dramatic than incremental growth. This does not require us to assume a single global catastrophe. Different cities may have experienced different triggers: flooding, fires, earthworks, replanning, political or economic resets. What matters is the result. Older urban environments were covered, new ones were built above them, and over time, the existence of the lower layers faded from public awareness. The city became a palimpsest, a surface rewritten again and again, with traces of earlier writings still visible beneath. This perspective also changes how we think about historical timelines. If buried layers represent fully developed urban environments, then the history we associate with certain periods may only describe the uppermost layer, not the entire city. What we call modern may be only the latest chapter, written over pages that were never fully erased. Archaeology teaches us that absence of memory does not equal absence of existence. Cities forget faster than stones do. The buildings beneath our feet do not ask to be believed. They simply exist. They wait for observation. When we view cities as layered artifacts rather than static achievements, the anomalies stop being anomalies. They become evidence. Evidence of transformation, evidence of replacement, evidence that urban history is far more complex than the surface suggests. And once we recognize this, a new question emerges. If modern cities sit atop earlier urban layers, how many chapters of human development remain unseen, not lost to time, but hidden beneath it? At this stage, the evidence beneath our cities leaves us with possibilities rather than conclusions, and that is exactly where serious investigation begins. Some researchers believe that what we now call basements were once street-level spaces built for everyday use and later redefined as underground. In this view, cities did not slowly grow upward. They were reorganized with new surfaces constructed above existing urban environments. Alternative historians suggest that periods of large-scale disruption may have forced rapid reconstruction, not necessarily a single global catastrophe, but repeated events that made it more practical to build over what already existed rather than dismantle it entirely. Flooding is often mentioned. So are fires, economic collapses, or abrupt shifts in governance. Others go further, proposing that parts of our urban history may have been reset, simplified in records, compressed into cleaner narratives that focus on what survived above ground rather than what was left beneath it. These ideas remain controversial. They are debated. They are far from settled. But controversy does not erase evidence. What we can say with confidence is that the buried layers beneath our cities were not accidental. They show planning, intention, and continuity. They represent complete environments, not fragments. At some point, those environments ceased to function as the surface of the city. And when that happened, something changed. Cities moved on. Streets were redefined. New levels became normal. Over time, the existence of what lay below faded from memory, even as the structures themselves remained. History often favors what is visible. What can be easily accessed, what fits within an established timeline. But cities are not obligated to follow our stories. They preserve their past in stone, regardless of how we interpret it. The layers beneath our feet remind us that history is not always erased. Sometimes it is simply covered. If our modern cities are only the top layer of something older, then understanding the past requires more than reading records. It requires observation, comparison, and the willingness to question assumptions we rarely think to examine. This is not about replacing one narrative with another. It is about recognizing that the story may be larger than we have been told. If entire streets once existed, where we now walk above them, what else might remain unseen? And how many chapters of human history are still waiting, not to be rediscovered, but simply noticed? If this exploration added value to the way you see the world around you, stay curious. Future episodes will examine underground streets, forgotten infrastructure, and other hidden layers of modern civilization. Not to claim definitive answers, but to document what history may have quietly left behind.